Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 25 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard the sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode, the crew of the HMS Resolution returned to Maritime and was warmly welcomed by familiar faces and new allies. The Tahitians, once wary, now displayed trust and generosity. They exchanged names with the visitors, gave gifts freely, and eagerly resumed trade. Georg and his companions came to see the islanders as naturally kind and hospitable, offering a powerful contrast to European fears. They then journeyed to Happai to meet Otu, the king of Tahiti Nui. There they found him seated among nobles in a ceremonial square. Tall and dignified, Otu impressed everyone with his calm and stately presence. His siblings also carried themselves with poise. Despite the pressing crowd, the meeting was conducted with respect. After placing their diplomatic offerings before the king, the visitors were invited to sit in his presence. The episode ended just as Georg and the others took their places in the royal circle, beginning their formal audience with Tahiti's highest chief, an encounter that would shape the course of their stay.
Tuesday, August 24th, 1773, Tahiti.
They sat among the king's uncles, aunts, cousins, and other relatives. All of these nobles competed to look at them kindly and tenderly, to declare their friendship, and to ask for beads and nails. The ways in which they tried to obtain these trinkets varied greatly and were not always equally successful. For example, when beads were being handed out among certain groups, some brazen young boys would push their way forward and hold out their hands as if entitled to the gifts. In such cases, they were always firmly refused. It was much harder to deny old venerable men when they took their hands with trembling fingers, pressed them warmly, and whispered their request with heartfelt trust. The older women used flattery and gentle tricks. They would ask for their names, call themselves their mothers, and introduce them to their family members, who thereby became their relatives as well. After more soft-spoken words came the pleading tone, "Aima poi iti no te taio metua," isn't there a little bead for the dear mother? Such requests tested their filial feelings, and when they did, the old ladies nearly always succeeded. These heartfelt appeals gave them a very high opinion of the people, for expecting kindness from others without showing it oneself was a level of social grace usually found only in more refined civilizations. Georg noticed that the younger relatives, in the bloom of youth, had other methods at their disposal. Many were attractive in their own way, and all of their behavior was designed to win favor. And since they referred to themselves so tenderly as sisters, they could hardly expect a refusal. After all, who could resist such charming, obliging young women? Meanwhile, as the noble ladies and gentlemen of the court received various gifts from the visitors, they had already sent off their attendants, tutus, to fetch large pieces of their finest cloth, dyed scarlet, rose red, or pale yellow, and perfumed with the most fragrant oil, to present as return gifts. They draped these fabrics over the Europeans' clothes, and loaded them so heavily that the guests could barely move. After the more important business of receiving gifts was completed, many questions followed regarding Tabane, Mr. Banks, Tolano, Dr. Solander, and other familiar names. Only a few individuals inquired about Tupaya, commonly called Parua, and they received the news of his death with surprising indifference, even though, in the young naturalist's opinion, Tupaia's vast knowledge should have made him valued and beloved among his people. During this exchange, the Highland soldier played a few tunes on the bagpipes, to the boundless delight of the audience, who listened in amazement and wonder. King O2 in particular was so impressed by the performance, despite its modest musical quality, that His Majesty handed the piper a large piece of coarser cloth as a reward. Since this was only a ceremonial visit, the group didn't intend to stay long. They were just about to take their leave when the arrival of Happai, the king's father, delayed their departure. The elderly man was tall and lean, with gray hair and a matching beard, yet despite his advanced age, he didn't appear frail or infirm. The gifts presented to him by the captains were received with a calm indifference, typical of aged individuals. Although the travelers were already aware from previous accounts that the rule on the island was assumed by the son during the father's lifetime, it still surprised the Englishmen that the old Happai also adhered to the customary etiquette and bared his shoulders in the presence of his son. This disregard for familial hierarchy, meant to enhance the authority of the royal title, seemed to Georg and the others a sign of a higher cultural refinement than what other voyagers had credited the Tahitians with. Even though Happai no longer wielded supreme power, the common people still showed him great respect due to his birth and former rank. His son, King O2, had also ensured that the old chief was well provided for. The district of Opare, directly under the former ruler's authority, supplied Happai and his attendants with what they needed. Out of regard for the elderly dignitary, the visitors extended their stay briefly, then bid farewell to both the retired and the reigning monarch. They returned to the pinnace, where Maritime had remained the entire time, likely hoping his absence from the shore would enhance his prestige among his compatriots, as if he were in special favor with the British. While the delegation had been away, tents had been set up at Point Venus for the woodcutters, water carriers, and the sick from the adventure. The astronomers from both ships had established their observatories on nearly the same spot, where during the previous voyage, Mr. Green and Captain Cook had observed the transit of Venus.
The observation of the transit of Venus by Captain James Cook and astronomer Charles Green in 1769 was part of one of the most ambitious scientific efforts of the 18th century. The transit, when Venus passes directly between the Earth and the Sun, occurs in pairs roughly every 120 years and offers a rare opportunity to calculate the astronomical unit, the average distance between the Earth and the Sun. Determining this distance would allow astronomers to establish the true scale of the solar system for the first time. This effort was not unique to Cook's expedition. It was a global scientific campaign coordinated by leading astronomical institutions across Europe, including the Royal Society in Britain. Observers were dispatched to various points around the world, from Siberia to India, from North America to the South Pacific, so they could measure the transit from different latitudes. These different vantage points were essential as they allowed scientists to apply the principle of parallax to triangulate the Earth-Sun distance with greater accuracy. Cook and Green were sent aboard the HMS Endeavour to Tahiti, one of the few locations in the southern hemisphere with clear skies and ideal positioning for observing the event. They set up their observatory at Point Venus, where they observed the transit on June 3, 1769. Despite challenges such as atmospheric distortion, what Green described as the black drop effect that made it hard to time the exact moment of contact, the data collected was of great value. The 1769 transit marked a milestone in international scientific cooperation and helped usher in a new era of precision astronomy. While the result varied in accuracy, the coordinated effort laid the groundwork for better measurements in the future. Cook's mission, though rooted in this astronomical goal, would eventually continue with an equally important second objective: the search for the unknown southern continent, Terra Australis. Thus, the transit of Venus was not only a pivotal event in astronomical history, it was also the spark for one of the greatest voyages of exploration ever undertaken.
Upon returning to the ship, Georg and the others found it crowded with islanders, including several people of higher status. These individuals, by virtue of their rank, had free access to all parts of the vessel, yet this privilege meant that nowhere aboard was safe from their constant requests for glass beads and other trinkets. To escape this unbearable pestering, both captains soon withdrew to the shore encampment again. Georg and his companions followed, eager to investigate what natural curiosities the land might offer. After dinner, they set out on another short excursion with the same goal. However, both walks were brief and yielded only a few new plants and birds not yet encountered in Aitepia. Early the next morning, a crowd of canoes arrived from Paray at the ship, and in one of the smallest vessels sat the king himself, wishing to personally deliver his gifts to Captain Cook. The offerings consisted of various provisions: a live pig, several large fish, including a cavala and a white albacore about 1.2 meters long, already prepared, and finally a number of baskets filled with breadfruit and bananas. One by one, the goods were handed aboard. Cook stood on the deck and invited the monarch to come up, but His Majesty remained motionless in the canoe. According to Tahitian etiquette, the captain first had to be dressed in an excessive quantity of the island's finest cloth. Once this ritual was fulfilled, and the Englishman had become an enormously bulky figure, Otoo finally climbed onto the quarterdeck. He embraced the commander, though he still appeared uneasy, despite the crew's sincere efforts to reassure him. Because the deck was already crowded with the king's entourage, they invited Otoo below into the cabin. However, the descent via the stairway seemed too unfamiliar and precarious at first glance. The king therefore sent his younger brother ahead, a handsome 16-year-old youth who clearly had full trust in the strangers. Pleased with what he saw, the boy reported back so favorably that the monarch decided to follow. Once in the cabin, the British presented the sovereign with a new round of valuable gifts, but the royal suite now pressed into the space so tightly that it was barely possible to move. Captain Cook suffered the most from the heat under his ceremonial layers. Every islander selected a personal friend among the visitors, and these new bonds of friendship were sealed through reciprocal gifts. By that time, Captain Furneaux had also arrived, and the group now sat down for breakfast. The guests, unfamiliar with such a setting, behaved calmly and allowed themselves to be seated on chairs, furniture that seemed both strange and wonderfully comfortable to them. The king observed their breakfast with great attention. The meal, this time a mixture of English and Tahitian dishes, amazed Otoo. He watched in disbelief as the visitors drank hot water, tea, and ate breadfruit with butter. The monarch himself could not be persuaded to join the meal, but several members of his entourage showed no such hesitation and helped themselves eagerly to whatever was served. After breakfast, His Majesty noticed Georg's father's poodle. The animal, though usually well-groomed, looked rather dirty that day, smudged with tar and pitch like a true sailor. Yet Otoo immediately expressed a desire to own the dog, and his request was certainly not denied. Delighted, the monarch assigned one of his chamberlains to take care of the animal, and soon had it following him everywhere. Not long after, the king informed Captain Cook that he wished to return to shore. With his entire entourage and the gifts he had received, he climbed back on deck. Captain Furneaux then presented him with a billy goat and a nanny goat, which he had brought for this very purpose. Explaining the usefulness of these animals and how to care for them took little effort, as the king quickly promised not to slaughter or separate them and to protect their offspring. Once the pinnace was ready, the king, accompanied by both captains and other gentlemen, departed for Opar, where he resided at the time. During the crossing, Otoo appeared in high spirits, asked many questions, and seemed to have shed all of his former distrust. His interest in the goats was so great that he could talk of nothing else. It seemed as if he couldn't hear often enough how to feed and raise them. When the boat landed, a shaded meadow beneath breadfruit trees was pointed out to the monarch as a suitable pasture. The entire shore was lined with islanders, who welcomed their king with loud cheers as he stepped ashore. Among the crowd was also Tutaha's mother, a dignified elderly matron with gray hair. As soon as she spotted Captain Cook, she rushed toward him and embraced him as the friend of her late son. At that moment, the memory of her loss overwhelmed her so deeply that she began to weep aloud, to the group's great emotion. Such tender feeling clearly revealed the innate goodness of the human heart, and always inclined the visitors to think favorably of those in whom they witnessed such emotion. They hurried from there to their tents at Point Venus, where the islanders had set up a proper market, offering all kinds of fruit, at very low prices. A whole basket of breadfruit or coconuts cost no more than a single glass bead. Georg's father met his friend Oahu there once again. The generous man presented him with a large supply of fruit, some fish, a piece of fine cloth, and even a pair of mother-of-pearl fishing hooks. When the naturalist tried to return the kindness with a gift of his own, the noble Polynesian refused outright to accept anything in return. He said he had given those items to the elder Forster as a friend, without expecting anything back. In this way, it seemed as though everything that day came together to strengthen their favorable impression of this kind-hearted people. Around midday, they returned to the ship, and after dinner occupied themselves with drawing and describing the natural specimens collected so far. Meanwhile, the decks remained constantly crowded with islanders of both sexes, who searched every corner and pilfered whenever they found the opportunity. In the evening, an incident occurred that struck Georg and his companions as strange and new, though it was something familiar to those who had been to Tahiti before. The sailors had invited a number of women of the lowest class aboard, who not only came willingly, but stayed on the ship after sunset, even as the rest of their countrymen returned to shore. Though Georg already knew from the previous anchorage how cheap the favors of Tahitian girls could be, back in Aitepiha they had only carried on their affairs during the day and never dared stay on the ship overnight. Here in Matavai, however, they had studied the English sailor more thoroughly. The women knew no doubt that he could be trusted, and that this was the best opportunity in the world to coax him out of nails, beads, axes, or shirts. Thus the evening aboard resembled more a raucous night in Spithead than a scene in the South Pacific.
The comparison of the ship to a raucous night in Spithead is a vivid reference rooted in the 18th century British naval and social culture. Spithead is a stretch of water off the southern coast of England near Portsmouth and served as one of the Royal Navy's principal anchorages. It was a crucial staging point for fleets preparing to sail and a common gathering spot for ships returning from long voyages. Because of its naval importance, Spithead, and especially the nearby town of Portsmouth, was closely associated with sailor life ashore, including its most unruly aspects. When ships were in port, hundreds or even thousands of sailors flooded the town, eager to spend their pay and escape the hardships of shipboard life. Taverns, inns, and brothels did booming business, and the atmosphere was notoriously chaotic, loud, and often drunken.
Before it got fully dark, the girls gathered on the foredeck. One played the nose flute, while the others danced various dances, some of which did not match Georg's or the crew's ideas of modesty. Yet, considering the simplicity of their upbringing and dress, much of what would be considered shameful in Europe could here be seen as innocent. The Tahitian lovers, in truth, appeared less brazen and dissolute than their supposedly more refined counterparts in Europe. As soon as darkness fell, they slipped below deck. Their lovers served them pork, and though the women had refused to eat earlier in front of their own people, due to a local custom that forbade men and women from eating together, they now devoured the meat with incredible appetite. Their greed was, to Georg and the others, proof that they rarely enjoyed such food at home. The tender sorrow of Tutaha's mother, the noble generosity of their friend Oahu, and the overall favorable impressions they had formed of the Tahitians made this night's display all the more jarring. Here were creatures who cast aside all duties of social life and gave themselves over entirely to base urges. Human nature, Georg thought, must be deeply flawed if such a kind, simple, and happy people could sink into such wildness and moral decay. It was indeed a tragedy that the most abundant and beautiful gifts of a benevolent Creator could be so easily misused, and that to err is, after all, so very human. The following morning, O2 arrived early at the ship, accompanied by his sister Tedua Torai and several relatives. He had a pig and a large albacore delivered aboard, but chose not to come aboard himself. The young monarch had brought similar gifts for Captain Furneaux, yet he hesitated to approach the adventure until Georg's father offered to accompany him. Even then, the Tahitian ceremony required the captain to be wrapped in local cloth before the royal visitor dared to step aboard. Once the ritual was complete, O2 felt secure and climbed onto the deck, where the commander of the adventure returned the presents with generous gifts of his own. While the young chief remained there, his sister Tedua Taurai was persuaded to visit Captain Cook's ship. During this visit, it was observed that all women present bared their shoulders as a sign of respect, an honor typically reserved for their king. The cheerful youth Watau, who had accompanied his elder brother, received the same homage and was referred to as Teri Watau. This suggests that, although the title Eri was used for district chiefs and nobility in general, it properly belonged, above all, to those of royal blood. After a short visit, O2 returned from the adventure to the Resolution, retrieved his sister, and together with her was accompanied by both captains back to Opara. On the morning of the 29th, as soon as day broke, they had their tents brought ashore and set out to explore the natural features of the island more closely. A heavy dew had fallen during the night, refreshing the plants, and together with the morning coolness, it made their walk very pleasant. At the camp, they found only a few islanders, though some of them accompanied the group to the river crossing, hoping to earn something in the process. Typically, for a single glass bead, these companions would carry the visitors across the water on their shoulders, sparing them from getting their feet wet. Most of the inhabitants had just woken up and were still bathing in the Maritime River, which was always their first activity of the day. In such a warm climate, frequent bathing was not only pleasant but essential, especially in the morning when the cool, fresh water helped strengthen the nerves, which otherwise might slacken under the constant heat. Moreover, physical cleanliness served not just to prevent infections, but also encourage social harmony among the people. In contrast, other uncivilized nations who bathed less frequently tended to be so unclean that even their own communities avoided crowding together, and the stench alone could drive off any outsider. Eventually, the small group reached a modest hut where a poor widow lived with her large family. Her eldest son, Nuna, a lively chestnut-brown boy of 12 with remarkably charming features, had always shown a special fondness for the Europeans. He also possessed a quick understanding, often grasping their meaning from half a word better than many of his fellow islanders, even when aided by pantomime or dictionaries. They had arranged with the boy the previous evening that he would act as their guide for the day. When they arrived, his mother was sitting on the stones outside the hut, surrounded by her children and offering coconuts and other provisions she had prepared for them. The youngest of the children appeared to be about 4 years old. Although the woman still seemed lively, her deeply wrinkled face suggested she was much older than the mother of such young children would typically be. Soon, a younger, well-formed woman of about 23 or 24 years approached, Nuna's eldest sister, as they learned. Based on her age, their mother was likely close to 40, but her appearance made her seem far older. In this land, where girls reach maturity so early, it wasn't surprising. Women here, though, remained fertile for 20 years or more, remarkable considering how early they started. This longevity was likely due to the fortunate simplicity of their lives, free from worry and hardship. That same simplicity likely accounted for Tahiti's strong and growing population. They came to an agreement with a strong man that he would carry the provisions the hospitable elderly woman had gathered for them. To do so, he hung them in equal portions at both ends of a pole about 120 centimeters long, and placed it on his shoulder. Nuna and his little brother, Topari, who was about 4 years old, cheerfully accompanied the group in high spirits, after the whole family had been gifted with beads, nails, mirrors, and knives as a farewell. Because of a mountain they had to climb, the beginning of their march was rather strenuous, and yet their effort went unrewarded. On the entire mountain, apart from a few small, stunted bushes and some dry ferns, they didn't find a single plant. However, to their surprise, they saw a flock of wild ducks rise before them from this dry, barren height. Why these birds had left their usual marshy riverbanks and reed beds to come here was hard to understand. Soon after, the group crossed another hill, where the ferns and bushes seemed to have been recently burned. Their clothes were soon completely blackened from brushing against the charred remains. As they descended, they reached a fertile valley, through which a lovely stream flowed toward the sea. The local inhabitants had dammed it with stones in several places to direct the water to their fields, which were planted with taro, a crop that thrives in marshy, flooded ground. There were two types of taro here. One had large, shiny leaves and a root nearly 120 centimeters long, though coarse and fibrous. The other bore small, velvety leaves and a finer, tastier root. However, both were sharp and pungent in flavor unless boiled in water several times. The pigs, on the other hand, devoured them raw without hesitation or harm. The further they followed the stream, the narrower the valley became, and the steeper and denser the forests on either side. Wherever the ground was even, coconut palms, banana plants, mulberry trees, and various root crops grew in abundance. There were also many houses, well built and close together. In several places, they found large beds of loose pebbles, seemingly washed down from the mountains and shaped into smooth forms by the constant motion of water. While collecting new plants on the hillsides, the explorers often found themselves in danger, as rocks sometimes rolled out from under their feet. A large number of islanders gathered around them, offering coconuts, breadfruit, and apples in great quantity for trade. They stocked up on provisions and hired a few men to help carry the goods. After walking about 8 kilometers, 5 miles, the group sat down on a patch of grass beneath the trees to have lunch. In addition to the fruit they had bought along the way, their meal consisted of pork and fish brought from the ship. The Tahitians stood in a circle around them, while the guides and carriers were invited to join them on the ground. The locals ate heartily, but were puzzled by the white powder the visitors dipped every bite into, something completely unknown to them. The crew had brought salt from the ship and used it for every dish, even with the breadfruit. Several islanders asked to taste it, and some found it appealing. It wasn't entirely foreign to their palate, since they were used to using seawater as a broth for their meat and fish. At around 4 in the afternoon, the crew thought it was time to begin the return journey. They now saw many islanders coming over the hills, carrying loads of wild plantains. These fruits grew without care in the mountains, but were of much poorer quality than those cultivated in the lowlands. The Tahitians intended to take their harvest to the market near the tents, so the Europeans followed them along the stream. At one spot, local children had been searching between the rocks for small prawns and offered some to the group. The naturalists gladly accepted them as a contribution to the island's natural history and gave the children a few glass beads in return. But as soon as the adults noticed this exchange, more than 50 people, both men and women, waded into the stream and brought back so many prawns that the visitors had to kindly decline and leave them unrewarded. After about 2 hours, the group reached their tents at Point Venus and found the honest Owahau waiting. Once again, he offered Georg's father a gift of fruit. During the day's excursion, the travelers had noticed that there were more idle people around Point Venus than in Itapeha. The houses and plantations here seemed more neglected, and instead of friendly invitations, they mostly heard insistent requests for beads and nails. Still, the group remained generally pleased with the local population. The Tahitians allowed them to wander freely and undisturbed through their beautiful land. It was true the visitors had experienced occasional petty thefts, but they had never lost anything of value. Since they usually carried only handkerchiefs, simple pieces of thin Tahitian cloth, in their easily accessible pockets, the thieves were often disappointed and returned the items with a smile. In Georg's view, this tendency to steal was less blameworthy among the Tahitians than it would be among Europeans. In a society where needs were so easily met and lifestyles so uniform, there was little reason to steal from one another. Their open houses, without doors or locks, proved they had no fear of theft within their own community. In fact, the foreigners themselves had provoked this weakness. By introducing unfamiliar and tempting objects, they had awakened desires that the locals could not easily resist. Moreover, the islanders themselves seemingly did not consider their petty thefts to be particularly blameworthy, perhaps because they believed no real harm was done to the Europeans.
This concludes part 25 of Georg Forster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of James Cook. I have linked a map of the locations of this episode in the show notes. So that was episode 25 of our journey around the world with Georg Forster, Captain Cook and the HMS Resolution, on which we will continue our travels together in the coming weeks. I hope we can travel a little further together, because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.